The chickens always knew before she did. That's what Clara Brennan told herself later, when everything made a terrible kind of sense. But on that first morning in late April, when the mountain air still carried the bite of winter and the last patches of snow clung to the shadowed slopes, she thought they were just being difficult. The henhouse sat 30 yards from her cabin, a weathered structure her grandfather had built in the 1950s with rough-cut pine and a tin roof that sang in the rain. Clara pushed open the door at dawn, her breath forming clouds in the cold air, expecting the usual chorus of clucks and the scramble of hens anticipating their morning feed. Instead, she found silence. 7 chickens stood motionless in their roosts, every head turned toward her. Not the casual awareness of birds noticing movement, but something else. Something that made the hair on her arms prickle beneath her flannel sleeves. Their eyes reflected the lantern light she carried, turning them into small, bright mirrors that watched without blinking. "What's got into you girls?" she said, her voice too loud in the stillness. None of them moved. The silence stretched, broken only by the creak of the henhouse door, swinging slightly in the wind. Clara set down her feed bucket and approached the nesting boxes, her boots crunching on the scattered straw. The chickens tracked her movement, heads swiveling in unison like they were connected by invisible strings. The first egg sat in the corner box, and Clara's hand froze halfway to reaching for it. It wasn't brown. It wasn't the pale cream of her buff Orpingtons, or even the occasional light blue some chickens could produce. This egg was covered in spots. Dark spots, irregular and organic-looking, spreading across a shell that seemed almost gray in the dim light. The pattern reminded her of something diseased, of tissue gone wrong, of things that shouldn't be. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story is touching you already, make sure you're subscribed. I've got something extra special saved for tomorrow. She picked it up carefully. The shell felt normal, smooth, and slightly warm, but those spots seemed to pulse in her peripheral vision. When she looked directly at them, they were just markings, dark splotches against lighter shell. Nothing moving, nothing alive. But her instincts, honed by 15 years alone on this mountain after her husband's death, screamed that something was profoundly wrong. Clara had raised chickens since she was a girl. She knew about shell abnormalities, calcium deficiencies, the occasional oddly shaped or textured egg. This wasn't that. This was something else entirely. The spots had depth to them, as if they went through the shell rather than sitting on its surface. As if the egg itself was changing from the inside out. She turned slowly, scanning the other nesting boxes. Every occupied box held an egg. Every egg was spotted, different patterns, different concentrations of marks, but all carrying that same rawness that made her stomach tighten. The chickens hadn't moved. They stood frozen on their roosts, watching her hold their impossible eggs. Clara's cabin stood at 7,800 feet in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, accessible only by a logging road that turned to mud every spring and became impassable in winter. She'd inherited it from her grandparents, and when her husband James had died in a logging accident 15 years ago, she fled here from the small town below, fled from the pitying looks and the well-meaning questions and the suffocating sense that everyone was watching her grief, measuring it, judging whether she was healing properly or falling apart appropriately. The mountain had given her what she needed most: invisibility, space to break down without an audience, time to rebuild herself into something that could survive without the man she'd planned to grow old beside. She was 52 now, weathered and strong in the way mountain solitude makes a person. Her hands were calloused from splitting wood and hauling water. Her face was lined from sun and wind, and the kind of crying you do when no one's around to see it. Her hair, once dark brown, had gone gray at the temples, and she kept it pulled back in a practical braid that hung between her shoulder blades. She lived simply. The cabin had no electricity except what her small solar panel provided for a few lights and the radio. Water came from a spring a quarter-mile up the slope. Heat came from the wood stove. Food came from her garden in summer, her pantry preserves in winter, and the chickens year-round. She made the 3-hour drive down the mountain to the nearest town once a month for supplies, and that was enough human contact to satisfy her. Or it had been enough, until now. Clara placed a spotted egg carefully back in its nest and backed away. The chickens remained motionless, watching. She grabbed the feed bucket and scattered grain mechanically, going through the motions while her mind raced. The hens didn't move to eat. They just stood there, feathers slightly ruffled, eyes bright and knowing. She left the henhouse and walked back to the cabin through morning air that felt heavier than it should. The forest around her clearing was waking up. Birds called from pines. A gray squirrel scolded from a high branch. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of her property rushed with snowmelt. Everything normal. Everything the same as it had been for 15 years. Except for the eggs. Inside the cabin, she made coffee on the propane stove, her movements automatic while her thoughts churned. She'd seen strange animal behavior before. The year before James died, their dog had refused to enter the barn for 3 days straight. On the 4th day, they'd found a copperhead coiled in the feed bin. Animals knew things, sensed things humans missed. But this felt different. This felt bigger. She drank her coffee standing by the window, looking out at the henhouse. The structure sat solid and familiar in the growing light, showing no signs of anything wrong. But Clara couldn't shake the image of those chickens, frozen and watchful, surrounding their impossible eggs like guards protecting something they didn't understand but knew mattered. The radio crackled from its shelf, tuned to the public station out of Asheville. She usually left it on for company, for the sound of human voices, even when they were talking about weather patterns or political news that felt distant and abstract from her mountain. But this morning, the voices felt intrusive. She switched it off. The silence that followed was absolute. Clara set down her coffee cup and made a decision. She would go back to the henhouse. She would collect those eggs. She would crack one open and see what was inside, and then she would know. Knowledge was better than speculation. Truth, however strange, was better than the fear of the unknown. She pulled on her work jacket, checked that her grandfather's knife was in her pocket, the weight of it reassuring, and headed back outside. The chickens had finally moved. They scratched in the scattered grain now, pecking and clucking with something approaching normalcy. But they gave her a wide berth when she entered, pressing themselves against the far wall of the henhouse, creating a corridor of empty space between her and them. Clara collected the eggs one by one, placing them carefully in her wire basket. 8 eggs total. 8 impossibilities. The spots seemed darker in the daylight, filtering through the henhouse window, more defined, as if they were developing, growing more distinct as the eggs sat exposed to air and light. She carried the basket back to the cabin, her steps careful on the uneven ground. Inside, she set the basket on the kitchen table and stared at its contents. The eggs sat nestled in straw, their spotted shells catching the morning light, streaming through the window. Beautiful in a way, terrible in another. Her hand shook slightly as she reached for one. Section 2. The catalyst inciting incident. Clara had cracked thousands of eggs in her life. The motion was automatic, practiced, thoughtless. Tap the shell against the bowl's edge. Apply pressure with both thumbs. Separate the halves and let the contents slide out. Simple, basic, ordinary. But her hands hesitated over this egg, fingers trembling against the cool, spotted shell. The kitchen was warm from the wood stove, sunlight now fully illuminating the room with that clean mountain brightness that made everything sharp-edged and real. Her grandmother's cast-iron skillet sat ready on the stove. The bowl waited. Everything was prepared for a normal breakfast, a normal morning, a normal continuation of her solitary, predictable life. She tapped the egg against the bowl. The sound was wrong. Not the clean crack of shell breaking, but something muffled, damp, as if the shell was thicker than it should be, or made of different material entirely. She tapped harder, and the shell gave way, but sluggishly, resisting. When she pulled the halves apart, her breath caught. The yolk was normal, golden orange, sitting perfect and round in its membrane. But the white, the albumin that should have been clear and viscous, was clouded, murky, and through that cloudiness, she could see threads, dark threads like the spots on the shell, but moving through the egg white in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost organized. Clara dropped the egg halves. They clattered into the bowl, the contents mixing into a mess that no longer looked like food. She backed away from the table, her heart hammering against her ribs. The remaining eggs sat in their basket, innocent and terrible. She needed to think. She needed to understand what she was looking at. Disease, maybe. Some kind of bacterial contamination. Mold growing inside the shell somehow, though she'd never heard of such a thing. There had to be a rational explanation. Had to be. But the threads had moved. She was almost certain they'd moved. Clara grabbed a jar from her shelf and approached the table again, forcing herself to be methodical. She scooped some of the contaminated egg into the jar, sealed it, held it up to the light. The threads were definitely there, dark lines suspended in the cloudy white. As she watched, one of them seemed to pulse. Just once. A single contraction like a muscle flexing or a heart beating. She set the jar down hard, glass thumping against wood. Outside, the chickens had started making noise. Not their usual clucking, but something higher-pitched. Distressed, Clara went to the window and saw them milling around the henhouse door, agitated, try to get back inside. But when she'd left, she'd closed and latched the door. They were locked out of their own coop, away from their nests, separated from whatever they'd laid. And they were frantic about it. Clara pulled on her boots and went back outside. The chickens rushed toward her, wings flapping, making sounds she'd never heard them make before. Almost like cries, almost like warnings. She'd raised these birds from chicks 3 years ago. She knew their personalities, their quirks, their sounds. This was fear. Pure animal fear. "What's wrong with you?" she said, but her voice lacked conviction. She knew what was wrong. They laid something they didn't understand, something that frightened them, and they wanted it back, or they wanted to guard it, or they wanted her to do something about it. She opened a henhouse door, and they rushed inside as a group, heading straight for the nesting boxes. But the eggs were gone. Clara had them, and the chickens knew it. They turned on her as one, 7 pairs of eyes fixing on her, with that same unnerving attention from the morning. One of the hens, a buff Orpington named Honey, stepped forward. Her feathers were puffed out, making her look twice her normal size. Her beak open, and she made a sound that was half crow, half shriek. A challenge, a demand. Clara had been around chickens her entire life. She'd seen them protect their eggs, seen broody hens get aggressive with anyone who came near their nests. But this was different. This was a maternal instinct. This was something that looked almost like rage. She backed out of the henhouse slowly, maintaining eye contact, not wanting to trigger a full attack. Chickens could be vicious when they wanted to be. Spurs and beaks could do real damage. And 7 of them, worked into the state, could seriously hurt her if they decided she was a threat. The moment she cleared the door, she shut and latched it. The chickens pressed against the wire window, clucking and squawking, their eyes never leaving her face. Clara's heart was racing as she walked back to the cabin. Her mind spun through possibilities, trying to find something that made sense. Some explanation that didn't involve the word she kept pushing away. Unnatural. Wrong. Impossible. But impossible things were sitting in a basket on her kitchen table. And 7 chickens who'd been her peaceful, productive companions for 3 years had just looked at her like she committed an unforgivable theft. Inside the cabin, she stood at the table and stared at the remaining 7 eggs. The spots seemed darker than they had been. Spreading. Growing. She was certain of it now. Whatever was wrong with these eggs, it was active, changing, progressing. She picked up the jar with the contaminated egg sample and examined it again in the full sunlight. The threads were more visible now, crisscrossing to the cloudy white in patterns that hurt to look at. Not because they were gross exactly, but because her brain kept trying to make sense of them, to find meaning in their arrangement and failing, like looking at words in a language she didn't know, where the shape suggested communication but conveyed nothing she could understand. Clara had lived alone long enough to know when she needed help and when she could handle things herself. This, she suspected, fell into the former category. But help meant people. Help meant leaving the mountain, driving down a town, trying to explain to someone why she was worried about spotted chicken eggs. They'd think she was crazy, the hermit widow who'd lost her mind up there in the woods. They'd be kind about it, probably. Concerned. They'd suggest she come stay in town for a while, see a doctor, talk to someone. All the things she'd fled up here to avoid. But if she didn't tell someone, if this was something dangerous, something that could spread or get worse, she'd be responsible for whatever happened next. The morning stretched into afternoon while she wrestled with the decision. She tried the radio again, hoping for news. Any reports of strange animal behavior, unusual egg production, weird agricultural phenomena. Nothing. Just the usual weather report predicting rain later in the week and a story about a local high school's baseball team. She made lunch mechanically, not tasting the food. The egg sat on the table, constant in her peripheral vision, waiting. By 3 o'clock, she'd made up her mind. She would keep the eggs, monitor them, document what happened. She would be scientific about this. Careful. If things got worse, if something definitively dangerous emerged, then she'd go to town. But not yet. Not until she had more information, more proof than just spotted shells and cloudy egg whites with strange threads. She found her old 35mm camera, the one James had given her years ago, and took photographs. Close-ups of the spots, shots of all 7 eggs arranged in the basket, detailed images of the jar's contents, evidence, documentation, the things that would make her story believable if she ever needed to tell it. Then she did something that felt both necessary and absurd. She cleared out the small root cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards, a space usually reserved for potatoes and onions and preserved goods. She lined it with clean straw, placed the 7 eggs carefully inside, and closed the hatch. If the chickens wanted their eggs, if there was something protective or important about keeping them safe, she would do that. But she'd do it on her terms in her space, where she could control what happened next. The chickens were still agitated when she checked them at sunset. They'd barely eaten their feed, barely drunk water. They stood clustered in the corner of the henhouse, huddled together, making low, worried sounds. Clara scattered fresh grain, replaced their water, did all the normal caretaking tasks. But she didn't open the root cellar, didn't bring the eggs back. That night, she barely slept. Section 3. The first reveal mystery deepens. The sound woke her at 3 a.m. A rhythmic thumping coming from beneath the kitchen floor. Slow, deliberate, like something knocking from inside the root cellar. Clara sat up in bed, her heart already racing, her ears straining in the darkness. The cabin was silent except for that sound. Thump, 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 patient and persistent. She lit the oil lamp on her bedside table, pulled on her robe, and padded barefoot into the kitchen. The sound was louder here, unmistakable, coming directly from beneath the floorboards where she'd stored the eggs. Her hands shook as she knelt and pulled up the hatch. Cool air rushed out, carrying a smell she didn't recognize. Not rot. Exactly. Not decay. Something else. Something mineral and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike. The 7 eggs sat in their straw nest, exactly where she placed them, but they were glowing. Faintly, barely visible even in the darkness, but definitely glowing. A pale greenish light emanated from within the shells, pulsing in time with the thumping sound. Thump, pulse, thump, pulse, like a heartbeat. Clara reached down, her hand hovering over the nearest egg. The heat rose from it in waves, far warmer than any egg should be. The spots on the shell were completely black now, standing out stark against that faint inner glow. And they were moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but moving, crawling across the shell's surface like living tattoos, rearranging themselves into new patterns. She pulled her hand back, her breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't disease. This wasn't contamination or spoilage or any normal biological process. This was something else entirely. Something that made every instinct she possessed scream to get away, to put distance between herself and whatever was happening in these eggs. But she was also curious. Desperately, dangerously curious. Because in 15 years of solitude, nothing had happened to her. Nothing had changed. She'd existed in a kind of stasis, going through the same routines, walking the same paths, thinking the same thoughts, safe and unchanging and slowly becoming invisible even to herself. And now something impossible was occurring in her root cellar, and part of her, the part that remembered being young and brave and excited about the unknown, wanted to see what came next. Clara closed the hatch carefully and sat back on her heels, thinking she needed information, needed to understand what she was dealing with. But a library was in town, 3 hours away. The internet, which she'd never bothered with, was equally inaccessible. Her only connection to the outside world was the radio, and the kind of information she needed wasn't likely to be broadcast on public radio, unless she'd lived on this mountain long enough to know she wasn't its only inhabitant. There was old Thomas Reed, who lived deeper in the forest, barely saw anyone, but knew these mountains better than anyone alive. He'd been here since before Clara was born, had learned from his grandfather who'd learned from his grandfather. If anyone understood strange occurrences in these woods, it would be him. But Thomas didn't welcome visitors, didn't like interruptions. The few times Clara had encountered him over the years, he'd been polite but distant, making it clear he preferred his solitude to remain undisturbed. Still, this seemed like circumstances that warranted disturbing someone. Dawn was still hours away when Clara made her decision. She would hike to Thomas's place at first light, show him the photographs, ask if he'd ever heard of anything like this. If he sent her away, at least she'd tried. If he had answers, she needed to hear them. She went back to bed but didn't sleep, just lay in the darkness, listening to that rhythmic thumping beneath her floor, feeling the faint vibration of it through the cabin's frame. Something alive, something growing, something that shouldn't exist but definitely did. When gray light finally began to seep through her window, Clara rose and dressed in layers. The temperature would drop as she climbed higher into the mountains toward Thomas's place. She filled a canteen, packed some jerky and hardtack in case the trip took longer than expected, and grabbed her walking stick from beside the door. The chickens were silent when she passed the henhouse. No morning sounds, no movement. She peered through the window and saw them all roosting, heads tucked, absolutely still, as if they were conserving energy, or waiting. The trail to Thomas Reed's cabin was steep and poorly maintained, more of a game path than anything meant for human traffic. Clara had only been up this way twice before, both times years ago. Both times met with polite but firm dismissal. But she remembered the way. The split pine tree that marked the first turn. The boulder field where you had to pick your path carefully. The creek crossing where the water ran fast and cold enough to numb your feet in seconds. She walked steadily, her breath forming clouds in the cold air, her mind circling endlessly around the eggs, the glowing, the movement, the impossibility of it all. The forest around her was waking up. Birds called. Squirrels chattered. Everything normal and alive, and following the patterns that had followed for millennia, except in her cabin, except in her root cellar, except in 7 spotted eggs that pulsed with light and warmth and something she had no name for. Thomas's cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, smaller than hers, built more into the mountain than on top of it. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating he was awake. Or maybe he never slept. At 80-some years old, she wouldn't have been surprised. She approached carefully, announced herself before she got too close. "Thomas, it's Clara Brennan. From down the ridge. I need to talk to you about something." Silence. Then the cabin door opened, and Thomas Reed stepped out. He was smaller than she remembered, shrunken with age, but his eyes were sharp and dark and missed nothing. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Come in then, but be quick about it. I've got work to do." Inside, the cabin was neat and spare, everything in its place, smelling of wood smoke and sage and old paper. Thomas gestured to a chair near the fire, and Clara sat, suddenly uncertain how to begin. "You wouldn't come up here without good reason," Thomas said, settling into his own chair. "So tell me what happened." Clara told him everything. The spotted eggs, the chicken's behavior, cracking the first egg and finding the threads, the glowing and the thumping and the movement of the spots across the shells. She showed him the photographs, watched his face as he studied them. His expression didn't change, didn't show surprise or disbelief, just careful attention. When she finished, he set the photographs down and looked at her for a long, measuring moment. "You kept the eggs," he said finally. "Yes, in my root cellar. The chickens are upset." "Very." He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd been thinking. How long you been up on that ridge? 15 years. Since my husband died. And you've been alone that whole time? Yes. Thomas stood and moved to a shelf packed with books and papers and objects Clara couldn't identify. He pulled down a leather-bound journal, old and cracked, and flipped through it carefully. Your grandparents built that cabin in the 50s. Yes. My grandfather homesteaded there. Did he ever tell you about the land? About what was there before? Clara shook her head. Just that it was good mountain land. Remote. Peaceful. Thomas made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something else. Peaceful. Right. He found what he was looking for in the journal, and turned it to face her. The page showed a hand-drawn map of the mountain, with specific locations marked in faded ink. One of the marks corresponded almost exactly to where her cabin stood. What am I looking at? Clara asked. Threshold site, Thomas said. Place where the old earth and the new earth meet. Where things that should stay buried sometimes surface. Where the rules aren't quite the same as they are everywhere else. The word sent a chill down Clara's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. What kind of things? Thomas closed the journal and looked at her with those sharp, knowing eyes. The kind that come in eggs. Thomas's cabin felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as Clara tried to process what he just said. The kind that come in eggs. As if this was normal. As if she should have expected it. I don't understand, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. What are you talking about? What's in those eggs? Thomas moved to a small kitchen area and put a kettle on the wood stove. Coffee first. This conversation needs coffee. He worked methodically, grinding beans by hand, measuring water. The mundane domesticity of it felt surreal given what they were discussing. Clara waited, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the photographs. The spotted egg looked innocent in the image, just an unusual shell pattern. The photo couldn't capture the glow, the movement, the sense of wrongness that emanated from the real thing. When Thomas finally sat back down with 2 tin cups of strong black coffee, he seemed to be gathering his thoughts, deciding how much to tell her, how much he could handle. Your grandfather, he began, came to see my grandfather before he built that cabin. 1953. I think it was, maybe 54. My grandfather was the one who knew the old stories, the old ways. He told your grandfather where not to build, showed him the safe places. Safe from what? From the threshold, from the places where Earth's memory is too strong, where old things sleep too close to the surface. Thomas sipped his coffee. There are spots on this mountain, Clara, where the world is thin, where what's underneath can push through if conditions are right. Clara thought about her root cellar, about the eggs glowing in the darkness beneath her kitchen floor. And my cabin is on one of these spots. Near one, your grandfather was smart, built just outside the boundary, close enough to feel it, far enough to be safe. Usually. Thomas paused. But thresholds shift. Earth moves. What was safe 60 years ago might not be safe now. So these eggs are from the threshold, from what lives there. The chickens, they're just vessels. They got too close, spent too much time in the wrong spot, and now they're carrying something that doesn't belong in this world. Not completely. Clara set down her coffee cup, her hand shaking slightly. You're telling me my chickens laid eggs from some kind of underground creature? That's insane. Is it? Thomas's eyes were sharp. You've seen them. You've felt them. They're warm when eggs should be cool. They glow when eggs should be dark. They move when eggs should be still. You came all the way up here because you know something impossible is happening. Don't start doubting that now. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist there had to be a scientific explanation, something rational and provable. But the memory of those pulsing lights, those crawling spots, the terror in her chicken's eyes, all pointed to exactly what Thomas was saying. What happens when they hatch? She asked quietly. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. I don't know. This hasn't happened in my lifetime. But my grandfather's journals mention something similar. 1920s, I think. Family had chickens start laying strange eggs after an earthquake opened up cracks in the ground. They let them hatch. And the family disappeared. Cabin burned down. Never found their bodies. He stood and retrieved the leather journal again, opened it to a different page. But the mountain folk who went up there afterward, they reported seeing things. Creatures that looked almost like birds, but wrong. Too many eyes. Wings that didn't move right. They stayed near the burned cabin for weeks. Then one day, they were just gone. Back down into the earth, people figured. Clara's throat felt tight. So what am I supposed to do? Destroy them? Before they hatch. You could try. Thomas's tone suggested he doubted it would work. But the chickens won't like it. And if you're too late, if they're too far along, breaking them might be worse than letting them finish. Worse how? Whatever's growing in there, it's connected to the threshold, to the old earth. Killing it might tear something open you can't close. He closed the journal. Or it might do nothing at all. Like I said, I don't know. This is beyond my experience. Clara stood, pacing the small cabin, trying to think. There has to be someone who knows more. Records, research, something. University, maybe. In Asheville, they've got archives, historical documents about the region. Thomas watched her pace. But you go asking about threshold creatures and eggs from the earth, they'll think you're crazy. You'd need proof. I have photographs. Photographs show spots on eggs. Nothing more. He was right, and she knew it. The camera couldn't capture what mattered. Couldn't show the impossible elements that made this real rather than just unusual. Then what do I do? The question came out more desperate than she intended. Thomas stood and moved to his shelf again, pulled down a small leather pouch. You watch them. You document everything. You prepare for whatever comes next. He handed her the pouch. And you keep this with you. Clara opened it carefully. Inside was a collection of items. Dried herbs she didn't recognize, small stones with markings carved into them, a vial of dark liquid. What is this? Protection. Old kind. Might work, might not. But if those things that hatch are from the threshold, they'll recognize these symbols. Might give you a chance to run if you need to. She took the pouch, the weight of it somehow comforting despite not understanding what half the items were. You really believe all this? The threshold, the old earth, creatures living underneath. I've lived on this mountain 83 years, Thomas said quietly. I've seen things that don't fit in the world people think they know. Learn to respect what I don't understand. You'd be wise to do the same. Clara left Thomas's cabin an hour later with more questions than answers, but also with a strange sense of relief. She wasn't crazy. This was real, and someone else, at least, understood that reality even if they couldn't fully explain it. The hike back down to her cabin felt longer, her legs heavy, her mind spinning. She thought about her grandfather, choosing the spot carefully, building just outside the boundary of something he'd been warned about. Had he ever seen anything strange? Had he kept secrets he'd never told anyone? Her grandmother had died when Claire was young, and her grandfather had followed not long after. She never thought to ask them about the land's history beyond the practical details of property lines and water rights. Now she wished desperately that she had. The sun was past noon when she reached her cabin. The chickens were out of the henhouse, scratching the dirt, but they stopped the moment they saw her. 7 heads turned in unison. 7 pairs of eyes fixed on her with that unsettling awareness. Clara ignored them and went straight inside. The root cellar hatch was where she'd left it, closed and latched. She knelt and opened it, bracing herself for the sight of those glowing eggs. They were brighter than before. The pale green luminescence had intensified, strong enough now to cast actual light on the surrounding straw, and the eggs had changed position. She placed them carefully, evenly spaced in the straw nest. Now they were clustered together in the center, touching, arranged in a pattern that looked deliberate, purposeful. Clara's breath caught. They'd moved on their own. Somehow, in the hour she'd been gone, 7 eggs had rearranged themselves into what looked almost like a formation, a gathering. She reached down, compelled to touch one despite every instinct screaming not to. The shell was hot, not warm, hot, like something feverish. and beneath her fingertips, she could feel movement, not the spots crawling across the surface, but something inside, something shifting, growing, pressing against the boundaries of the shell. She jerked her hand back and slammed the hatch shut. The radio. She needed information. Thomas had mentioned the university in Asheville, their archives. Maybe she could call, ask general questions about local folklore, historical oddities. It was a long shot, but she had to try something. The problem was, she didn't have a phone. Never needed one up here. The radio could receive but not call out except for emergency broadcasts to the ranger station. She'd have to drive to town, use a payphone, waste precious hours on what would probably be a dead end. But what else could she do? Sit here and watch the eggs glow brighter, feel them grow hotter, wait for whatever was inside to emerge? Clara made her decision quickly. She'd go to town, make some calls, maybe stop by the library, see if there were any old newspaper articles about strange occurrences on the mountain. It was better than sitting here helpless. She packed a bag with the photographs, Thomas's protection pouch, and a notebook to record anything she learned. She checked on the chickens one more time, made sure they had food and water, then headed to her truck. The old Ford started on the third try, coughed into life with its usual reluctance. The logging road down the mountain was rough, the spring mud making it treacherous, but Clara had driven 1,000 times. She knew where to slow down, where the road washed out every year, where to watch for fallen trees. It took 2 hours to reach the main highway, then another hour to get to Marshall, the nearest town big enough to have a library and payphones. Population 872, most of whom Clara had been avoiding for 15 years. She parked on Main Street, feeling exposed and conspicuous in her mud-splattered work clothes and mountain-worn face. People glanced at her as she walked to the library, some with recognition, most without. The hermit widow, the woman who lived alone, the one who chose solitude over community. The library was small, just 3 rooms, but the woman at the desk was friendly, young, maybe late 20s, with bright eyes and an eager smile. "Can I help you find something?" Clara hesitated. "How did you ask for information about impossible eggs without sounding insane?" "I'm looking for historical information about the Blue Ridge area, specifically about local folklore, old stories about the mountains." The librarian's eyes lit up. "Oh, we have a whole section on regional history. Are you working on a project?" "Something like that." She was led to a back room lined with shelves of old books, archived newspapers, and bound collections of local histories written by amateur historians and dedicated residents. "Take your time," the librarian said. "Let me know if you need help finding anything specific." Clara spent the next 3 hours digging through dusty volumes and yellowed newspapers. She found plenty of folklore, stories about ghostly lights in the mountains, animals that spoke prophecy, trees that bled, the usual mix of tall tales and exaggerations that every rural area accumulated. But then, in a collection of interviews conducted in the 1960s with elderly mountain residents, she found something that made her hands freeze on the page. Interview with Martha Holloway, age 87, conducted June 1964. "My grandmother told me about the eggs. Said it happened when she was just a girl, maybe 1870 or so. Her family had chickens, and one spring they started laying eggs that weren't right. Spotted eggs, glowing eggs. Her father wanted to smash them, thought they were cursed, but her mother wouldn't let him. Said the mountain would be angry if they destroyed what it had given. They let the eggs be, and one night they hatched. Things came out that looked like birds but weren't. My grandmother said they had too many wings, and their eyes were wrong. They flew up into the sky and disappeared. And after that, the family's luck changed. Good crops, healthy livestock, like the mountain was rewarding them for respecting what it had created. But other families, the ones who smashed the strange eggs when they appeared, they had nothing but trouble. Fires, accidents, sickness. The mountain remembers. My grandmother used to say, it remembers who honors it and who doesn't. Clara read the passage 3 times, her heart pounding. This had happened before, multiple times, across generations. And there was a pattern. Those who protected the eggs were rewarded. Those who destroyed them were punished. But Thomas's story had been different. The family in the 1920s had let the eggs hatch and disappeared. So which was true? Was honoring the threshold safe? Or was it deadly? She photographed the page with her camera, then kept searching. She found 2 more references to strange eggs, one from the 1930s, another from the late 1800s. In both cases, the outcomes were vague. Strange occurrences, unexplained phenomena. Nothing definitive about whether the families had survived or thrived or suffered. The library was closing when the young librarian approached. Find what you needed? Some of it. Do you have a phone I could use? I need to call the university in Asheville. Sure, there's one in the office. The librarian led her to a small room with a desk and phone. Take your time. Clara pulled out the number she'd written down earlier, hands shaking slightly as she dialed. The phone rang 4 times before someone answered. Western Carolina University, Archives Department. Hi, I'm researching local folklore and historical phenomena in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Specifically, unusual occurrences related to eggs and chickens. Do you have any records or documents that might? Hold on. The voice on the other end sounded bored. Probably use an odd request from amateur researchers. Let me transfer you to Dr. Morrison. She specializes in Appalachian folklore. The line clicked and went quiet for a moment, then a new voice. Older, female, with a hint of curiosity. This is Dr. Elaine Morrison. I understand you're asking about eggs. Clara explained as briefly as she could, leaving out the glowing and the movement, focusing on the historical angle. Strange spotted eggs appearing in chicken coops, local stories about threshold phenomena, families experiencing odd events afterward. Dr. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Can you come to Asheville? I have materials that might interest you, but I prefer to discuss them in person. When? Tomorrow, if possible. This isn't something I want to talk about over the phone. The urgency in the professor's voice sent a chill through Clara. I'll be there. What time? 2 o'clock. Ask for me at the archives building on campus. A pause. And bring any documentation you have. Photographs. Notes. Anything concrete. The line went dead. Clara sat in the quiet office, her mind racing. Dr. Morrison knew something. Something significant enough that she wouldn't discuss it over phone. Something that required seeing evidence in person. The drive back up the mountain was dark, her headlights cutting through the night, illuminating the narrow logging road that seemed more treacherous than usual. She kept thinking about Martha, Holloway's grandmother, about families rewarded and families punished, about choices made with incomplete information and consequences that lasted generations. When she finally reached her cabin, it was past midnight. The chickens were silent in their henhouse. The forest was dark and still. Everything looked normal. But when Clara opened the root cellar hatch, she saw that the eggs were even brighter now, glowing with an intensity that hurt to look at directly, and they were hot enough that she could feel the heat rising from the cellar without even reaching down. They were close to hatching. She could feel it in her bones. Whatever was inside those shells, it was almost ready to emerge, and she had less than 14 hours to figure out whether she should let it. Section 5, The Deeper Secret, Second Layer Revelation. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table, the hatch to the root cellar open, watching those 7 glowing eggs pulse with increasing intensity. Every instinct told her to run, to get in her truck and drive away and let whatever happened happen without her there to witness it. But she couldn't. This was her land, her chickens, her responsibility. And something deeper, something she couldn't quite name, kept her rooted to that chair, a sense that she was meant to be here for this. That running would be a betrayal of something important. Around 3 a.m, the eggs began to hum. It was a low sound, barely audible, more felt than heard, a vibration that seemed to come to the floor, through the chair she sat in, through her bones. The kind of sound that made her teeth ache and her skull feel too tight. The spots on the shells were moving constantly now, swirling in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. Clara forced herself to look away, to break the trance before it could pull her in completely. She'd heard stories about people who stared too long at the wrong things, who lost themselves in patterns they weren't meant to understand. She made coffee as the sky began to lighten, her hands automatic through exhaustion. The drive to Asheville would take 3 hours. She needed to leave by 10 to make the meeting with Dr. Morrison, which meant she had about 7 hours to pack, prepare, and decide whether leaving the eggs unattended was safe or reckless. The chickens were awake when she checked on them at dawn. They stood in a line at the fence closest to the cabin, facing her door, perfectly still, waiting. Their eyes caught the morning light, turning them into small mirrors that reflected nothing and everything. Clara fed them, changed their water, went through all the normal motions while they watched without moving. When she finished and turned to leave, they finally broke formation, turning away from the cabin in unison and walking to the far corner of their yard, as if they completed their vigil and could rest now. Back inside, Clara gathered everything she thought Dr. Morrison might want to see. The photographs, her notes from the library, Thomas's protection pouch, which she decided to bring despite how crazy it would seem. If the professor was willing to meet with her about threshold phenomena, maybe she'd understand the significance of old mountain magic. She also wrote down everything that had happened in chronological order. First appearance of the spotted eggs, the chicken's behavior, cracking the contaminated egg, the glowing, the movement, Thomas's explanation about thresholds and old earth, the library research, all of it documented in clear, factual language that made the impossible sound almost reasonable. At 9:30, she checked the eggs one final time. They were so bright now that looking directly at them left after images in her vision. The heat radiating from the cellar had warmed the entire kitchen, and the humming had grown louder, no longer just a vibration, but an actual sound, like distant thunder that never quite resolved into a crack. Clara made a decision. She couldn't leave them like this, exposed and unprotected. She needed to close the hatch, seal them away, hope that whatever happened occurred while she was gone, and she could deal with the aftermath rather than the event itself. But as she reached for the hatch, one of the eggs cracked. Not a small crack. A split that ran from top to bottom, jagged and deliberate, as if something inside had drawn a line and followed it perfectly. Light spilled from the opening, brighter than the glow that had been emanating from the shell, pure and white and almost painful to look at. Clara froze, her hand suspended over the hatch, every muscle locked in indecision. Close it now. Seal whatever was emerging inside. Or watch. Bear witness to what came next. The crack widened. Something moved inside. She caught a glimpse of darkness against that brilliant light. Something unfolding. She slammed the hatch shut. Her heart hammered as she latched it, pressing her weight against the wood, as if whatever was hatching might try to push through. But the hatch held. The light seeped through the cracks between the boards, thin lines of brilliance that made the kitchen floor look like it had been drawn with luminescent chalk. The humming grew louder. Angry, maybe, or just insistent, demanding to be acknowledged. Clara backed away from the hatch, grabbed her bag, and ran for the truck. The drive to Asheville passed in a blur. Clara's hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly. Her eyes seeing the road, but her mind replaying that moment over and over. The crack, the light, the darkness unfolding inside. What had she done? Had she delayed the inevitable or prevented something catastrophic? Would closing the hatch anger whatever was emerging? Make a hostile instead of neutral? The questions chased each other in circles until she felt dizzy with them. Western Carolina University sat on the eastern edge of Asheville, a sprawling campus of brick buildings and green spaces. Clara found the archives building easily enough, an older structure set back from the main quad, surrounded by ancient oaks. Dr. Elaine Morrison was waiting in her office, a small cluttered space packed with books and papers and artifacts Clara couldn't identify. The professor herself was in her 60s, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that reminded Clara of Thomas's. Sharp, missing nothing, seeing more than most people could. Ms. Brennan. Dr. Morrison stood and extended her hand. Her grip was firm, her skin cool. Thank you for coming. Please sit. Clara sat in the offered chair, suddenly aware of how she must look. Exhausted, disheveled, probably half wild from weeks of isolation, followed by days of impossible events. But Dr. Morrison didn't seem judgmental, just interested. Intensely, completely interested. "Show me what you brought," she said. Clara laid out the photographs first. The spotted eggs in their basket, the close-ups of the patterns, the jar with contaminated egg sample, which she'd wrapped carefully and transported in a cooler. Dr. Morrison examined each item meticulously, using a magnifying glass for photographs, holding the jar up to the light and studying its contents without speaking. When she'd finished her examination, she sat back and looked at Clara with an expression that was part excitement and part something that might have been fear. "How many eggs?" she asked. "7. All laid by the same chickens?" "Yes. Different hens, but all from the same flock." "And they're still intact?" "Haven't hatched." Clara hesitated. "One started to crack this morning. I closed the cellar before I could see what emerged." Dr. Morrison's eyes widened slightly. "You trapped it?" "I don't know. Maybe. I panicked." The professor stood abruptly and moved to a filing cabinet, pulled out a thick folder, and spread its contents across her desk. Old photographs, newspaper clippings, hand-drawn diagrams, documents that looked like they'd been photocopied from very old sources. "What you're experiencing," Dr. Morrison said, her voice careful and measured, "has been documented 23 times in the Appalachian region since we started keeping records. Probably happened hundreds of times before that, but those occurrences were lost to oral history or deliberately suppressed." She pulled out one of the photographs. It showed a cluster of eggs that looked almost identical to Clara's. Spotted. Wrong. The image was black and white and old, but the similarity was unmistakable. "This is from 1947, North Georgia. A woman named Patricia Vance had chickens that laid eggs just like yours. She documented everything, took photographs, kept detailed notes. Then she disappeared. Her cabin was found empty. No signs of struggle. No body. Just gone." Clara felt cold despite the warm office. "What happened to the eggs?" "That's the thing. According to witnesses, the eggs hatched. Things emerged that looked like birds but weren't. They flew into the forest and vanished. And 3 days later, Patricia Vance was found wandering the mountains 30 miles from her cabin. She was alive but changed. Couldn't speak clearly. Couldn't explain where she'd been. She died 2 months later in a psychiatric facility, still insisting she'd been under the mountain with the old ones." Dr. Morrison pulled out another document. 1923, Tennessee. Similar events. Eggs hatched. The farmer tried to kill the creatures that emerged. He died that night. Heart attack, the official record says. But the local doctor noted his body showed signs of extreme stress, like he'd been frightened to death. Case after case. Family after family. Some survived. Some disappeared. Some died. But the pattern was consistent. Strange eggs appeared. They hatched. What emerged wasn't natural, and anyone who encountered the hatchlings was changed. One way or another. Were they? Clara whispered. Dr. Morrison sat back down, her expression troubled. The indigenous peoples in this region, the Cherokee and earlier inhabitants, they had stories about threshold beings, creatures that live between the world above and the world below. Not spirit exactly, but not physical either. Something in between. They served a purpose. What purpose? Renewal. Recycling. The old earth eating the new earth, digesting it, returning what's useful and discarding what isn't. Dr. Morrison tapped one of the photographs. These eggs, they appear during times of transition, when the land is stressed, when human activity has disrupted natural patterns too severely. The threshold responds by sending these beings up to, I don't know, assess? Correct? We're not entirely sure. Clara thought about her grandfather building the cabin in the 1950s, post-war development, logging roads being cut through previously untouched forest, the mountain being opened up to human habitation in ways it never had been before. "My land is on a threshold site," she said. "I suspected as much. They tend to choose properties that sit right on the boundary, close enough to the threshold that the beings can emerge, but far enough from true wilderness that they encounter humans immediately." Dr. Morrison leaned forward. The question is, what do they do once they encounter us? The stories say some families were rewarded, others punished. Yes, and I think it depends on how the humans respond. If you show respect, if you honor the threshold, you're seen as worthy of coexistence. If you show fear, aggression, disrespect, you're seen as a problem the beings were sent to solve. Clara's throat tightened, and the people who disappeared, the ones who were changed, I think they were taken, shown the threshold, made to understand what they've been living on top of, and some minds can't handle that knowledge. Dr. Morrison's expression was sympathetic. You need to make a choice, Ms. Brennan. Either you destroy those eggs before they fully hatch, leave your property and never go back, or you let them hatch, face what emerges, and hope you're judged worthy. That's not a choice. That's impossible. I know, but it's the only option you have. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible mountain stories, like this one. Section 6. The threat escalates external pressure. Clara left the university in a daze. Dr. Morrison had given her copies of all the documents, the research, the case studies, 23 documented occurrences, countless undocumented ones, a pattern of impossible events that somehow followed consistent rules. The drive back to the mountain should have given her time to think, to process, to make a decision, but her mind felt frozen, unable to move forward or backward, stuck in a moment when she'd slammed the root cellar hatch shut and trapped something that was trying to be born. She stopped for gas in Marshall, the small town now feeling even more alien than before. People went about their normal lives, buying groceries, chatting on sidewalks, completely unaware that 40 miles up the mountain, eggs were hatching creatures from an earth older than human memory. As she filled her tank, a man approached her, mid-50s, wearing a county sheriff department jacket. She recognized him vaguely. Deputy something. He'd been at James's funeral 15 years ago. Ms. Brennan? Clara Brennan? She nodded, wary. I'm Deputy Frank Collins. We've had some reports I wanted to ask you about. He pulled out a small notebook. You been having any unusual activity up at your place? Strange lights? Sounds? Anything out of the ordinary? Clara's blood went cold. Why do you ask? Couple of hunters reported seeing lights on the ridge where your cabin is. Bright lights, unusual patterns. One of them swore he heard humming. Thought maybe you had some kind of generator running, or maybe someone was trespassing on your land without your knowledge. She forced herself to stay calm. When was this? Last night, around midnight. Collins watched her face carefully. Everything okay up there? Everything's fine. Just been doing some maintenance work. Must have been my lanterns they saw. The lie came easily, but her heart hammered against her ribs. Maintenance at midnight? I keep odd hours. Living alone, you set your own schedule. Collins nodded slowly, clearly not entirely convinced. Well, if you notice anything unusual, or if someone is on your property without permission, you give us a call. We've had some concerns about squatters using the old logging roads, setting up camps. Don't want you up there alone if something's not right. I appreciate that, but I'm fine. She finished pumping gas and got back in her truck, hands shaking as she started the engine. The lights had been visible from miles away. The humming had been audible to people passing through the forest. Whatever was happening in her root cellar wasn't staying hidden anymore. The logging road up to her cabin seemed longer than usual, the shadows deeper as afternoon faded toward evening. Clara's mind raced with the implications. If people had seen the lights, if they'd heard the sounds, more would come to investigate. Curious neighbors, well-meaning officials, maybe even researchers who'd heard about strange phenomena on the mountain. She couldn't let anyone near the cabin while the eggs were hatching. Couldn't risk someone interfering, destroying what was emerging, triggering whatever punishment the threshold dealt out to those who showed disrespect. But she also couldn't protect the eggs indefinitely. Couldn't stand guard alone against everyone who might come looking. The cabin appeared through the trees just as the sun touched the western peaks. Everything looked normal from the outside. The chickens were in their henhouse. The forest was quiet. No lights, no humming, no signs of the impossible events occurring beneath her kitchen floor. But the moment Clara opened the cabin door, she knew something had changed. The root cellar hatch was open, not just unlatched, fully open. The heavy wooden door thrown back against the floor, the dark opening exposed, and the eggs were gone. Clara stood frozen in the doorway, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. She'd latched that hatch. She was certain of it, had weighted it down with her chair before leaving. There was no way it could have opened on its own, unless what was inside had been strong enough to push through. She approached the opening slowly, every sense on high alert. The cellar was empty, just straw and darkness, and the lingering smell of ozone. No eggs, no shells, no evidence that anything had been there at all, except for 7 shallow indentations in the straw where the eggs had rested. They'd hatched. While she was gone, they'd hatched and emerged and left. Clara's breath came in short gasps as she backed away from the cellar. Where were they now? What had emerged? Were they still in the cabin, hiding, waiting? Or had they left entirely, gone back down into the threshold, their purpose completed? She grabbed a flashlight and searched the cabin methodically. The bedroom, empty. The bathroom, empty. The small storage room, empty. Nothing. No creatures. No signs of disturbance beyond the open hatch. Outside, the chickens were agitated again. Not the frozen watchfulness from before, but active distress. They paced in their enclosure, wings flapping, making those high-pitched distress sounds that meant predators were near. Clara went to them, flashlight sweeping the area around the henhouse. The fence was intact. The door was closed. Nothing had gotten in. But the chickens pressed themselves against the far wall, staring up at the roof. She followed their gaze, and her heart stopped. 7 shapes perched on the peak of the henhouse roof. They looked like birds at first glance. Roughly the right size, the right basic structure. But as Clara's flashlight illuminated them, the wrongness became apparent. They had too many wings. Not just 2, but 4, 6, 8, folded against bodies that seemed to shift between solid and something less defined. Their eyes were too large, and they reflected the light in colors that didn't exist in nature. Iridescent purples, metallic greens, colors that hurt to look at, and they were watching her. All 7 of them, with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware, unmistakably judging. Clara stood absolutely still, Thomas's words echoing in her mind. Show respect. Honor the threshold. Don't show fear or aggression. I didn't mean to trap you, she said quietly, her voice shaking despite her efforts to control it. I was scared. I didn't understand. But I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm not trying to destroy you. The creatures tilted their heads in unison. The motion was bird-like, but also disturbingly synchronized, as if they were connected, thinking as one organism rather than 7 individuals. One of them opened its beak. The sound that emerged was not a bird call. It was a humming from before, concentrated and directed, a vibration that Clara felt in her teeth, in her bones, in the soft tissue of her brain. Not painful, but overwhelming, impossible to ignore. The other 6 joined in, and the sound swelled. The air seemed to thicken with it. Clara wanted to cover her ears, to run, but she forced herself to stand her ground, to meet their gaze, to show that she wasn't a threat. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the humming stopped. The creatures launched themselves from the roof in perfect unison, not flying like birds, but moving through the air in ways that defied physics. They seemed to fold space around themselves, appearing in one location, and then another without crossing the distance between. They circled Clara once, twice, close enough that she could feel the displacement of air, could smell that strange ozone scent that clung to them. Then they rose higher, ascending into the darkening sky, their forms becoming less distinct as they climbed. At about 50 feet, they began to glow, the same pale green luminescence that had emanated from the eggs, but brighter now, purer. They looked like stars that had descended too close to Earth and were struggling to return home. Clara watched them rise until they were just points of light against the twilight. Then even those faded and they were gone, disappeared into the sky or back into the threshold or into some space between that human eyes couldn't follow. The forest was absolutely silent in their wake. Clara stood in her yard for a long time, staring at the empty sky. Tried to understand what had just happened. The threshold beings had emerged. They'd assessed her, judged her, and then left. She was still alive, still conscious, still herself. Did that mean she'd passed whatever test they'd been administering? Or had they simply deemed her too insignificant to bother with? She didn't know. But as she stood there in the gathering darkness, she became aware of something else. The chickens had gone quiet. Not the frozen silence from before, but peaceful quiet. Normal chicken sounds. Soft clucking. The rustle of feathers as they settled for the night. She checked on them, shining her flashlight through the wire window. They were roosting calmly, eyes closed, completely relaxed for the first time in days. Whatever had been troubling them was gone. The eggs had hatched. The beings had emerged and departed. The crisis, it seemed, was over. But when Clara went back inside her cabin, she found something that told her the story wasn't finished. On her kitchen table, arranged in a perfect circle, were 7 stones. Smooth river stones, each about the size of a hen's egg, each marked with symbols she didn't recognize but felt were significant, important. They hadn't been there when she'd left that morning. She was certain of it. The threshold beings had left her a message, or a gift, or a warning. She wouldn't understand which until morning. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table, the 7 stones arranged before her, her fingers tracing the symbols carved into their smooth surfaces. The markings were unlike anything she'd seen before. Not quite letters, not quite pictures, but something in between. Flowing lines that seemed to suggest meaning without quite revealing it. As dawn broke, she made a decision. She needed Thomas. He'd lived on this mountain longer than anyone. He'd seen things, new things. If anyone could interpret what the threshold beings had left behind, it would be him. But when she stepped outside, she found she wasn't alone. 3 trucks were parked at the edge of her clearing. Men in hunting gear stood talking, gesturing toward her cabin. And among them, she recognized Deputy Collins. Clara's stomach tightened. This was exactly what she'd feared. People coming to investigate. Officials asking questions she couldn't answer without sounding insane. She walked toward them with forced confidence, her boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The men turned as she approached, their conversation dying. Ms. Brennan. Deputy Collins stepped forward. Sorry to intrude so early. These gentlemen reported more unusual activity last night. Lights in the sky. Strange sounds. Said they saw something taking off from your property around dusk. The hunters nodded. One of them, a weathered man in his 60s, spoke up. We were setting up camp about a half-mile east of here. Saw these lights, bright green, rising from your ridge. Never seen anything like it. Thought maybe it was some kind of military aircraft, but the way they moved... He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. Wasn't natural, another hunter added. The way they just appeared and disappeared, like they were blinking in and out of existence. Clara kept her expression neutral. I didn't see anything unusual. I was inside all evening. You didn't see lights rising from your own property? Collins's tone was skeptical. These men are experienced outdoorsmen, Ms. Brennan. They know what aircraft look like, what drones look like. They say this was something else. I don't know what to tell you. Maybe they saw some kind of atmospheric phenomenon. We're pretty high up here. Sometimes you get strange light effects with the clouds, and... There were no clouds last night, the older hunter interrupted. Clear sky, and these lights were solid. Real. They rose from this area specifically. He pointed toward her henhouse. Right about there. Clara felt trapped. Denying what they'd seen only made her look suspicious, but confirming it would lead to questions she couldn't answer. More people coming to investigate. Researchers, government officials, the kind of attention that would make continuing to live here impossible. Look, she said carefully, I live alone up here. I mind my own business. I don't know what you saw, but I can assure you there's nothing dangerous or illegal happening on my property. If you want to look around, go ahead. You won't find anything. It was a calculated risk. Let them search, find nothing, and leave convinced the lights had come from somewhere else. The eggs were gone. The beings were gone. The only evidence was 7 stones on her kitchen table, and those could be explained as ordinary rocks she collected. Collins nodded slowly. I appreciate your cooperation. Mind if we take a look at that henhouse? Since that's where the lights seem to originate. Be my guest. She led them to the henhouse, her heart pounding but her face calm. The chickens were outside in their yard, scratching and pecking normally. No strange behavior. No indication that anything impossible had occurred. Collins and the hunters examined the structure thoroughly, looked at the roof where the threshold beings had perched, checked the ground for tracks, peered through the windows at the interior, found absolutely nothing. Seems normal, Collins admitted. Just chickens. That's what I've been telling you. The older hunter wasn't satisfied. What about inside your cabin? Mind if we look there too? Clara hesitated just long enough to seem like a woman who valued her privacy, not long enough to seem like someone hiding something. Fine, but I'd appreciate if you're quick about it. I have work to do. She led them inside, watching as they scanned her small living space. The kitchen with its stove and simple shelves. The bedroom visible through the open door. The bathroom, everything ordinary and mundane, and exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd lived alone on a mountain for 15 years. Collins's eyes landed on the kitchen table, on the 7 stones. Pretty rocks, he said casually. You collect them? From the creek. I like the way they look. The lie came smoothly. He picked one up, examined it, his finger tracing the carved symbols. For a moment, Clara's breath stopped. Would he recognize them as unnatural? Would he see what she saw? But he just set it back down. Nice. My daughter likes to collect river stones, too. The hunters looked around a bit more, opened her root cellar hatch, and found nothing but empty straw and the lingering smell of ozone that could have been explained by 1,000 things. They checked her small storage room, her shelves, even glanced at her bed as if threshold beings might be hiding under it. Satisfied, Clara asked when they'd finished. Seems like you're telling the truth, Collins said. Nothing here but a woman and her chickens. He turned to the hunters. Maybe what you saw came from further up the mountain. There's old mining operations up there, abandoned shafts. Sometimes gas pockets can create weird light effects. The hunters looked unconvinced, but nodded. They'd done their civic duty, reported what they'd seen, let law enforcement investigate. What more could they do? But as they headed toward their trucks, the older hunter paused and looked back at Clara. You ever see anything strange up here? Living alone all these years, you must have noticed odd things now and then. Clara met his gaze steadily. The mountains are strange by nature. You learn to accept it. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. I suppose you do. When their trucks finally disappeared down the logging road, Clara let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. That had been close. Too close. If they'd come a day earlier, if they'd arrived while the eggs were still glowing in her root cellar, there would have been no explaining it away. But the danger wasn't over. More people had seen the lights now. More people were talking. It was only a matter of time before someone else came to investigate. Someone less easily satisfied than a deputy and a few hunters. She needed answers. Needed to understand what the stones meant, what the threshold beings had done by emerging and departing, what her role was supposed to be now that the crisis had passed. She needed Thomas. Clara hiked to Thomas Reed's cabin for the second time in 3 days, her legs burning from the steep climb, her mind racing with everything she needed to tell him. The 7 stones were in her pack, wrapped carefully in cloth, their weight a constant reminder of how her life had changed in less than a week. Thomas was outside when she arrived, splitting wood with the methodical precision of someone who'd been doing it for 8 decades. He saw her coming and didn't seem surprised. They hatched, he said. Not a question. A statement. Yesterday, while I was in Asheville, Clara set down her pack. They left me these. She unwrapped the stones and laid them out on his porch railing. Thomas set down his axe and approached slowly, wiping his hands on his worn jeans. When he saw the symbols, his expression changed. Something that might have been awe or might have been fear, or might have been both. 7 stones, he said quietly, marked with the old tongue. You can read them? Some of it. My grandfather taught me a little. Enough to recognize what they are, if not exactly what they say. He picked up one of the stones, held it close to his face, squinted at the markings. This is a covenant stone. A binding. Clara's throat tightened. Binding what? You to the threshold. The threshold to you. Thomas set down the stone and picked up another. The beings that emerged, they judged you, found you worthy. These stones are proof of that, evidence that you've been accepted as keeper. Keeper what? The boundary, the threshold site on your land. Thomas examined the third stone, his weathered fingers tracing the symbols with something like reverence. This hasn't happened in my lifetime, not in my father's lifetime either. The last time threshold beings emerged and left covenant stones was 1887, according to my grandfather's journals. Family named Harrison. They became protectors of the mountain, tended the threshold for 3 generations before the knowledge was lost. Clara thought about the story she'd read in the library, about families rewarded and families punished. What does it mean to be keeper? What am I supposed to do? Thomas set down the stones and looked at her with those sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through to her bones. You protect the threshold. Make sure it's not disturbed. Make sure people don't build on it, mine it, destroy it. You become the guardian of what's underneath, the voice for what can't speak in human language. And if I refuse, if I just want to go back to my quiet life, then you leave, pack up, sell the property, move away and never come back. His expression was grave. But the threshold will remember. And the next time beings emerge, they won't be so gentle. They'll come up angry, defensive. They'll see all humans as threats because the one they chose rejected them. The weight of responsibility settled on Clara's shoulders like a physical burden. She'd spent 15 years in isolation, avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement, avoiding obligations and expectations, and the complicated web of human relationships. But this wasn't human relationship. This was something older, bigger, more important than her desire for solitude. How do I protect it? She asked quietly. I'm one woman. I can't fight off developers or stop the government if they decide to run a road through my property. You don't fight them directly. You use the covenant. Thomas gathered the stones and handed them back to her. These give you authority. Not legal authority that courts would recognize, but something deeper when you need to protect the threshold. You place these stones in a circle around the area, and you ask. Ask who? The threshold itself. The old earth. The beings that live underneath. Thomas's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were explaining how to milk a cow or fix a fence. They'll hear you. They'll respond. How they respond depends on the threat, but they'll protect what's theirs. Clara wrapped the stones carefully and put them back in her pack. Her mind was spinning with implications. She'd wanted answers, but the answers only led to more questions, more responsibilities, more impossible choices. There's something else, Thomas said. Something you need to know before you commit to this. What? Being keeper changes you. Not all at once, but gradually. You'll start to see things other people can't see, hear things they can't hear. The boundary between your world and the threshold world gets thinner. You'll never be fully human again, not the way you were before. Clara thought about Patricia Vance, the woman who'd emerged from a mountain after 3 days, changed and unable to explain what she'd seen. Is that what happened to the people who disappeared? They became too much a part of the threshold. Some of them, yes, they went too deep, stayed too long, lost track of which world they belonged to. Thomas's expression was sympathetic. But if you're careful, if you maintain boundaries while honoring the covenant, you can walk the line, live in both worlds without losing yourself in either. You sound like you're speaking from experience. Thomas smiled slightly. My grandfather was keeper before the knowledge was lost. He taught me some of it before he died. Not enough to take on a role myself, but enough to recognize it when I saw it. Enough to know that it's real, even if I can't fully participate. Clara shouldered her pack, feeling the weight of the stones, the weight of the choice she was being asked to make. I need time to think about this." "You don't have much time." Deputy came by here too, asking about lights. More people are curious. If you're going to claim keeper status, you need to do it soon, before someone else decides to investigate your property more thoroughly. The hike back down to her cabin felt longer than usual. Clara's legs were tired, her mind exhausted from processing impossible information. But beneath the fatigue, something else was growing, a sense of purpose, of meaning. For 15 years, she'd existed, survived, gone through the motions of life, without really living. The grief of losing James had hollowed her out, and she'd never bothered to fill the empty spaces back up. But this was something real, something that mattered beyond her own small survival. The threshold needed protecting. The old earth needed a voice. And for reasons she didn't fully understand, the threshold beings had chosen her. Maybe it was because she'd lived here long enough to prove she respected the land. Maybe it was because her grandfather had built on the boundary with permission, creating a legacy of honoring the threshold. Maybe it was just chance or fate or the inscrutable logic of creatures that existed between worlds. It didn't matter why. What mattered was what she did next. Section 8. The victory resolution achieved. Clara spent the next week preparing. She read everything Dr. Morrison had given her, studied the patterns in the documented cases, tried to understand what successful keepers had done differently from those who'd failed or disappeared. She also began to explore her property in a new way, not just as land she owned, but as territory she was responsible for protecting. She walked the boundaries with the 7 stones in her pack, feeling for places where the threshold felt closer to the surface, areas where the air seemed heavier, where sound were muffled or amplified in unusual ways, where her skin prickled with awareness of something just beyond normal perception. She found 3 such spots. One near the creek, where the water ran over smooth stones that seemed to hum with low-frequency vibration. One in a small clearing about a quarter-mile north of her cabin, where nothing grew except a specific type of moss that glowed faintly at twilight. And one directly beneath her root cellar, which explained why the eggs had been drawn there, why they had hatched from that specific location. At each spot, Clara placed the 7 stones in a circle and spoke. Not formal words or ritualistic phrases, but simple, honest communication. "I'm here. I understand now. I'll protect this place. I'll make sure it's not disturbed." She didn't expect a response. But each time, she felt something. A shift in the air. A sense of acknowledgement. As if the threshold itself was listening, measuring her sincerity, deciding whether to accept her offer. The chickens returned to normal. They laid regular eggs again, brown and cream-colored and perfectly ordinary. They showed no signs of the trauma they'd experienced, though they did seem more aware somehow, more attentive to Clara's movements, more responsive to her voice. And Clara herself began to change. It started small. She noticed sounds she'd never consciously heard before, the specific pitch of wind through different types of trees, the distinct calls of individual birds, the subtle variations in the creek's voice depending on water depth and flow speed. Then colors became richer. The forest seemed to have more shades of green than she'd ever noticed. The sky held more blues. Even the gray stones of her cabin walls revealed unexpected variations, undertones of purple and gold and deep brown. And at night, when she stood on her porch looking out at the dark forest, she began to see the lights, faint glows in specific locations, markers of threshold sites scattered across the mountain, evidence that her property wasn't the only place where the old earth pushed close to the surface. She was seeing the world the way keepers saw it, the way people who lived between ordinary reality and something older had always seen it. It should have frightened her, should have felt like losing her mind. But instead, it felt like waking up, like she'd been living half asleep her entire life, and was finally becoming fully conscious. 2 weeks after the threshold beings had hatched and departed, Clara received an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 40s drove up the logging road in a battered Jeep, parked in Clara's clearing, and approached the cabin with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where she was going and why. "Clara Brennan?" The woman extended her hand. "I'm Sarah Harrison. I believe my great-great-grandfather knew your grandfather." Clara shook her hand, startled. Harrison, the family Thomas had mentioned. The last keepers before the knowledge was lost. "Come in," she said. Inside, over coffee, Sarah explained. My family kept records. Journals, photographs, documents about the threshold sites on this mountain. Most of it was lost over the generations as people moved away or died without passing on the knowledge. But my grandmother preserved what she could. When I inherited her papers last year, I started researching, trying to understand what my ancestors had been protecting. She pulled a worn journal from her bag and laid it on the table. I found entries about this property, about your grandfather meeting with my great-great-grandfather in 1953. They drew maps together, marked the threshold sites, discussed how to protect them. Clara opened the journal and saw hand-drawn maps that matched her own explorations perfectly. The 3 spots she'd identified were clearly marked, along with 2 others she hadn't found yet. "Why are you showing me this?" Clara asked. Sarah's expression was serious. "Because something happened here recently. I felt it. About 2 weeks ago, there was a shift. The threshold opened and then closed in a new pattern, like a door that had been locked for decades, suddenly opened, let something through and locked again." She leaned forward. "I think threshold beings emerged on your property, and I think you were chosen as keeper." Clara studied the woman's face, trying to decide how much to reveal. "What makes you think that?" "Because the same thing happened to my great-great-grandfather in 1887. He documented the entire event. Eggs appearing, strange behavior, beings emerging, covenant stones left behind." Sarah pulled out another document, this one a photocopy of old handwritten pages. He wrote down everything: how to interpret the stones, how to protect the threshold, how to live as keeper without losing yourself. Clara's hands trembled as she took the papers. This was it, the knowledge that had been lost, the instructions that could help her navigate this impossible responsibility without ending up like Patricia Vance, lost in change and unable to find her way back to her humanity. "Why give this to me?" Clara asked. "Your family could reclaim the keeper role. This is your heritage." "I'm not strong enough." Sarah's admission was simple and honest. "I feel the threshold, but I can't fully connect to it. The gift skipped my generation, maybe, or maybe I'm just not suited for it. But you were chosen directly by the threshold beings. That's rare, powerful. You have a connection I'll never have." She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the forest. "But you shouldn't do this alone. Keepers in the past had support, family members who knew the truth, friends who could help protect the secret. I'd like to be that for you, if you'll let me." Clara felt something loosen in her chest. An isolation she hadn't even realized was choking her. For 15 years, she'd been alone by choice. But maybe it was time to let someone in. Not into her grief, not into her personal life, but into this new responsibility that was bigger than both of them. "I'd like that," she said quietly. Over the next month, Clara and Sarah worked together. They mapped all 5 threshold sites on Clara's property. They performed small rituals of protection at each one, using the instructions from Harrison family journals. They placed the covenant stones strategically, creating a network of guardianship that covered the entire boundary. And Clara learned. She learned how to read the threshold's moods, how to sense when it was agitated or peaceful. She learned which plants grew only in threshold soil and could be used for protection or communication. She learned the old tongue well enough to recognize basic concepts in the symbols carved into her stones. She also learned that being keeper didn't mean isolation. Sarah visited regularly, bringing news from other parts of the mountain, sharing research she'd found, offering companionship that Clara had forgotten she needed. And slowly, Clara began to heal, not from losing James. That wound would always be part of her, but from the emptiness that had followed, the sense that her life had ended when his did, that she was just marking time until her own death released her. Now she had purpose, had meaning, had a future that mattered. The chickens thrived. Clara's garden grew with unexpected abundance. The forest around her property felt healthier, somehow more balanced, as if the threshold, properly protected and honored, was giving back more than it took. Section 9, The New Life, Epilogue and Future. 6 months after the threshold beings had emerged and departed, Clara stood on her porch at dawn, watching the forest wake up. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and with smoke from her chimney. The mountains were dressed in fall colors, reds and golds and deep oranges that made the landscape look like it was burning with gentle fire. She held a cup of coffee, steam rise in the cold air, and felt something she hadn't felt in 15 years. Content. Not happy, exactly. Happiness felt too simple for what she experienced. But content. At peace with where she was and who she'd become. The 7 covenant stones sat on her porch railing, arranged in their protective pattern. She touched them every morning, a small ritual of connection, acknowledging her responsibility, reaffirming her commitment. The chickens emerged from their henhouse, clucking their morning greetings. They laid normal eggs every day since the threshold beings hatched. No more spotted shells, no more glowing. Just good, healthy hens doing what hens do. But sometimes at twilight, Clara would see them standing in a row, all facing the same direction, watching something she couldn't quite see, responding to echoes of the impossible things they carried, changed by their experience in ways she understood better now. She was changed too. The world looked different to her eyes, sounded different to her ears. She could sense the threshold sights across the mountain, could feel when they were disturbed or threatened, could communicate in small ways with the old earth that lived beneath her feet. Deputy Collins had come by twice more, following up on reports of lights and strange sounds. Each time, Clara had shown him nothing but a quiet cabin, peaceful chickens, and the ordinary life of a woman who preferred solitude. He'd stopped investigating after the second visit, satisfied that whatever people thought they saw was just mountain phenomena, misidentified wildlife, or overactive imaginations. But Clara knew more reports would come. More hunters would see lights. More people would hear humming. The threshold was active in ways it hadn't been for decades. Other sites across the mountain were waking up. Other beings were emerging. Sarah Harrison was tracking the occurrences, documenting new threshold activity. Try to find other potential keepers who could protect sites that were currently unguarded. It was slow work, complicated by the fact that most people didn't want to believe in impossible things, preferred to explain away the strange rather than accept it. But Clara had learned that truth didn't require belief to be real. The threshold existed whether people acknowledged it or not. The old earth remembered whether humans forgot it or not. And threshold beings would continue to emerge whenever conditions were right, regardless of whether anyone was there to witness it. Her role was to be there, to witness, to protect, to serve as the bridge between worlds that had grown too separated. She'd started keeping a journal, documenting everything she learned, not for publication or academic study, but for whoever came after her, the next keeper, whether that was decades from now or centuries. The knowledge needed to be preserved. The mistakes needed to be recorded so they wouldn't be repeated. Dr. Morrison called occasionally, checking in, asking carefully worded questions that Clara answered honestly within the limits of what could be discussed over a phone line. The professor had become an unexpected ally, someone who understood the academic side of what Clara was experiencing, who could provide context and historical precedent. And Thomas Reed, still sharp and steady at 83, hiked down to her cabin once a month. They'd sit on the porch, drink coffee, talk about the mountain and its mysteries. He'd tell her stories his grandfather had told him. She'd share what she was learning. A transfer of knowledge across generations, making sure the chain didn't break again. Clara's relationship with solitude had changed. She still valued quiet, still needed time alone to recharge, but she no longer used isolation as a shield against pain. No longer hid from human connection, because connection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the possibility of loss. She'd learned that some things were worth the risk, that meaning required engagement, that protecting the threshold meant being part of something larger than her individual fear or comfort. The sun crested the eastern peaks, throwing golden light across her clearing. The chickens scattered to forage, their movements peaceful and ordinary. The forest hummed with morning sounds, birds and insects, and the distant rush of the creek. Everything looked normal. Everything was normal, except that Clara could see the faint shimmer in the air above her root cellar, evidence of threshold energy rising and falling like breath, could hear the low-frequency vibration that, Ordinary ears couldn't detect, could feel the presence of something vast and ancient living just beneath the surface of the everyday world. She was keeper now, guardian of the boundary, voice for what couldn't speak in human language. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she fled to this mountain 15 years ago, broken and grieving and desperate for invisibility. But it was the life she'd been chosen for, the life that mattered. And standing on her porch as the sun rose over the ancient mountains, Clara understood something profound. The threshold beings hadn't just emerged to assess the land or test her worthiness. They'd emerged to wake her up, to pull her out of the half-life she'd been living and force her to become fully present again. James's death had broken something in her, but the threshold had rebuilt it. Not the same as before, but stronger, more aware, more connected to the world in all its ordinary and extraordinary dimensions. She finished her coffee and set the cup on the railing. There was work to do. The northern threshold site needed checking after last week's heavy rain. Sarah was coming by this afternoon to discuss reports of unusual animal behavior near one of the unmarked sites. And Clara wanted to spend time documenting the new plant species she found growing in threshold soil, something that looked like ordinary fern but glowed faintly when touched. The work was never finished, would never be finished. That was the nature of being keeper. Constant vigilance, endless learning, perpetual responsibility. But for the first time in 15 years, Clara felt alive. Truly, completely alive. She walked down the porch steps and into her day, into her life, into the work that would define her remaining years. The chickens followed her toward the garden, clucking contentedly. The forest watched with its thousand eyes. The threshold pulsed beneath her feet, ancient and patient and enduring. And Clara Brennan, once a widow fleeing grief, now a keeper protecting impossibility, smiled. She was home. She was needed. She was exactly where she belonged. The story wasn't over. But this chapter, the chapter of isolation and fear and running from pain, was complete. A new chapter was beginning, one written in covenant stones and threshold light, one that would continue long after Clara was gone, passed on to whoever the threshold chose next. But for now, in this moment, on this mountain, in this impossible, beautiful life, she was enough. The keeper, the guardian, the bridge between worlds. And that was everything. 3 weeks after Clara had fully accepted her role as keeper, the first real test came. She was in her garden, harvesting the last of the fall vegetables before the hard frost hit, when she heard the sound of heavy machinery. Diesel engines grinding up the logging road. Multiple vehicles moving slowly, carefully, toward her property. The chickens heard it too. They stopped their foraging and turned as one toward the sound, their bodies tense, their heads cocked at that specific angle that meant danger approaching. Clara stood, wiping dirt from her hands, her stomach tightening with dread. She walked to the edge of her clearing and watched as 3 trucks appeared through the trees. Not hunters, not casual visitors. Official vehicles with county markings and Marshall Land Survey printed on the doors. Behind them came a 4th truck. Private, expensive. The kind of vehicle people from the city drove when they ventured into the mountains pretending they belonged. Clara counted 6 men total as they parked and began unloading equipment, surveying tools, measuring devices, stakes and flags and rolls of orange tape. The kind of supplies that meant boundaries were about to be drawn, territory claimed, plans made. A man in his 50s, wearing clean jeans and a new flannel shirt that had never seen real work, approached her with an extended hand and a practiced smile. "Ms. Brennan, I'm Robert Dalton, Dalton Development Corporation. I hope we're not disturbing you." Clara didn't take his hand. "You are. What's this about?" Dalton lowered his hand, his smile never wavering. "We've been authorized by the county to survey this area for potential development. There's been interest in opening up some of the higher elevation properties for recreational use. Cabins, hiking trails, maybe a small resort, bringing tourism dollars to the region. This is my property. You can't survey it without my permission." Actually, Dalton pulled out a folded document from his jacket. "According to county records, there's some dispute about the exact boundaries here. Your deed shows one set of coordinates. But the original homestead grant from the 1950s shows slightly different ones. We're just here to clarify where the lines actually are. Clara took the document and scanned it quickly. Legal language she didn't fully understand, but the implications were clear. They were claiming that part of her property, possibly including one or more of the threshold sites, wasn't actually hers, that it was unclaimed land, available for development. "This is wrong," she said flatly. "My grandfather's deed is clear. I've paid taxes on this property for 15 years. There's no dispute." "Well, that's what we're here to determine." Dalton gestured to the survey team, who were already unpacking their equipment. "Once we establish the actual boundaries, we can sort out any discrepancies. Shouldn't take more than a few days." Clara's mind raced. If they surveyed the threshold sites, if they started marking boundaries and planning construction, they'd disturb the old earth, anger it, trigger exactly the kind of response that had destroyed other families who'd shown disrespect. She thought about the covenant stones sitting on her porch, about Thomas's words. When you need to protect the threshold, you place these stones in a circle around the area. And you ask. "You need to leave," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. "Now." Dalton's smile finally faltered. "Ms. Brennan, I understand you're protective of your privacy, but this is official county business. We have authorization." "I don't care about your authorization. This land is protected. You can't develop it." "Protected how?" "There's no designation on record, no conservation easement, no historical landmark status." Dalton's tone was becoming patronizing, the fake friendliness dropping away. "Look, I get it. You've lived here a long time. You don't want change. But progress happens whether we like it or not. The best thing you can do is cooperate. Make sure the survey is accurate, and then we can discuss fair compensation if any of the disputed land turns out to be yours." Behind him, the survey team had started walking toward the northern part of Clara's property, toward the threshold site near the creek. They carried their measuring equipment, their stakes, their rolls of orange tape that would mark the land for destruction. Clara made her decision. She turned and walked quickly back to her cabin, ignoring Dalton's calls for her to wait, to be reasonable, to think about what she was doing. She grabbed the 7 covenant stones from her porch railing and headed toward the creek at a run. The survey team had already reached the threshold site. They were setting up their equipment, preparing to take measurements, completely unaware that they were standing on ground that shouldn't be disturbed, that had been protected for generations, that housed something far older and more important than their development plans. "Stop," Clara shouted as she approached. "Don't touch anything." The surveyors looked up, confused. One of them, a young man in his 20s, actually laughed. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job. No need to get excited. You don't understand. This area is sacred. It's dangerous. You need to leave immediately." "Sacred to who?" The young man exchanged amused glances with his colleagues. "This is just forest, rocks and trees. Nothing special about it." But Clara could see what they couldn't. The faint shimmer in the air, the way the moss glowed slightly brighter where they were standing. The subtle vibration in the ground that made her teeth ache. The threshold was aware of them, was responding to their presence, was preparing to defend itself. She didn't have time to convince them with words. Didn't have time to explain the impossible. She had to act. Clara moved to the center of the threshold site, to the exact spot where the old earth pushed closest to the surface, and began placing the 7 stones in a circle. The surveyors watched, bewildered, as she worked quickly, positioning each stone with precision, speaking under her breath in a fragment of the old tongue she'd learned. "What's she doing?" one of them asked. "I don't know. Some kind of hippie ritual?" The young surveyor shook his head. "Ma'am, this doesn't change anything. We still have to complete the survey." Clara finished placing the stones and stood in the center of the circle. She closed her eyes, pressed her palms flat against the ground, and did what Thomas had taught her. She asked, not in English, not in words exactly, but in intention, in pure, desperate communication with the old earth beneath her. "They don't understand. They don't mean disrespect. But they'll destroy this place if I don't stop them. Please, help me protect what we both guard. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground began to vibrate. Not an earthquake, not violent shaking, just a low, powerful vibration that seemed to come from deep underground, rising slowly toward the surface. The kind of sensation you felt more than heard, that register in your bones before your ears. The surveyors felt it. Their amused expressions faded, replaced by confusion, and then growing alarm. "Is that an earthquake?" one of them said. The vibration intensified. The creek's water began to flow backward, defying gravity and logic, rising upstream for several feet before stopping, suspended, trembling. The moss on the stones started glowing brighter, bright enough now that even the surveyors could see it. Pale green light that pulsed in rhythm with the vibration. And then the birds went silent. Every sound in the forest stopped. The wind died. Even the water in the creek, still suspended impossibly, made no sound. The young surveyor who'd laughed at Clara took a step backward. "What's happening?" "The land is telling you to leave," Clara said quietly. "If you're smart, you'll listen." The ground vibration shifted, changed pitch, became almost a growl, a warning issued not through sound but to the fundamental frequency of the earth itself. One of the older surveyors, a man who'd probably lived in these mountains his whole life, dropped his equipment. "We need to go. Now." "Don't be ridiculous," the young man started to say, but his words died as something moved in his peripheral vision. Shapes in the forest. Not quite solid. Not quite transparent. Threshold beings. Clara realized, though not the same ones that had hatched from the eggs. These were larger, older, guardians that had been sleeping deep beneath the mountain and were now rising in response to threat. They didn't approach, just stood at the edge of the clearing, watching with too many eyes, their forms shifting between animal and something else entirely. Bear-like, wolf-like, bird-like, all of those and none of those, existing in states that human eyes struggled to process. The young surveyor made a sound that might have been a whimper. His colleagues were already retreating, backing away slowly, keeping their eyes on the impossible shapes that surrounded them. "Ms. Brennan!" Dalton's voice came from behind them. He'd followed the survey team and was now standing at the edge of the threshold site, his face pale, his earlier confidence completely gone. "What is this? What's happening?" "This is why you can't develop here," Clara said. "This land is protected, not by laws you'd recognize, by something older. If you try to build here, if you disturb these places, what you're seeing now will be the least of your problems." The threshold beings moved closer. Not threatening, exactly, but making their presence undeniably clear, making it obvious that this was their territory and humans were only tolerated as long as they showed respect. Dalton stared at the shapes, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He was a man who believed in contracts and permits and legal frameworks, a man who thought power came from money and influence and official authorization. But standing at the edge of the threshold, facing beings that existed outside every framework he understood, he realized how small his power actually was. "We're leaving," he said finally. "Everybody back to the trucks. Now." The survey team didn't need to be told twice. They abandoned their equipment and ran, stumbling over roots and rocks in their haste to get away. Dalton followed more slowly, his eyes never leaving the threshold beings, his face showing the expression of a man whose worldview had just been shattered. Clara waited until they were gone, until the sound of their engines faded down the logging road, before she spoke to the threshold. "Thank you. They won't come back. I'll make sure of it." The vibration in the ground slowly decreased. The creek water resumed its normal flow. The moss dimmed back to its usual faint glow. And the threshold beings, those ancient guardians, faded back into the forest and down into the earth from which they'd emerged. The covenant stones remained in their circle, glowing softly, proof that what had just happened was real and not some shared hallucination. Clara gathered the stones carefully and returned to her cabin. Her hands were shaking, adrenaline still flooding her system. She'd done it, protected the threshold, used the covenant to defend what needed defending. But she also knew this wasn't over. Dalton had seen things he couldn't explain. His survey team had witnessed the impossible. They'd talk, tell people, And Clara would be at the center of those stories, the crazy mountain woman who'd somehow conjure monsters to defend her property. She needed help, needed witnesses who could provide alternative explanations, needed legal protection that went beyond threshold guardianship. She reached for her radio. Section 11, the community response, building support. Within 2 hours, Sarah Harrison arrived with a lawyer named Patricia Chun, a woman in her 40s who specialized in land rights and conservation law. They sat at Clara's kitchen table while she explained everything that had happened. Patricia listened without interrupting, taking notes in a precise, methodical way. When Clara finished, the lawyer set down her pen and looked at her steadily. "Here's what's going to happen," Patricia said. "Dalton Development will file a complaint. They'll claim you threatened them, possibly use some kind of technology or chemical agents to create hallucinations. They'll push for a court order to allow them back on the property to complete the survey. Can they do that? They can try. But here's what they don't know." Patricia pulled out her own folder of documents. "Sarah contacted me 3 months ago about this property. We've been researching the deed history, the original homestead grant, every piece of documentation related to these boundaries. And we found something interesting." She spread papers across the table. Old surveys, property records, historical documents that showed the exact coordinates of Clara's land. "Your property boundaries are exactly where you think they are," Patricia continued. "Dalton's claim of disputed territory is based on a deliberate misreading of the original grant. They're hoping you won't have the resources to fight them legally, that you'll just accept their survey and let them claim whatever land they want." Clara felt a surge of relief. "So I can stop them legally, without needing the threshold?" "You can. But more than that, we can protect this land permanently." Patricia pulled out another document. "There's a process for establishing conservation easements. You retain ownership, but you legally restrict what can be done with the property. No development, no resource extraction. The land is protected in perpetuity." "And that would stop Dalton?" "Completely. Once the easement is in place, it doesn't matter what his surveys show. The land can't be developed. Period." Sarah leaned forward. "There's more. I've been in contact with other families who have threshold sites on their properties. Most of them don't understand what they have, but they know the land is special, should be protected. If we can establish conservation easements across multiple properties, we create a network of protected threshold sites, a preserve that honors what's underneath while keeping it safe from human interference." Clara looked at the documents spread across her table. Legal protections, community support, a framework that combined human law with threshold guardianship. "How long will this take?" "For the easement on your property? About 3 months if we move quickly." Patricia began gathering the papers. "In the meantime, I'll file an injunction preventing Dalton from entering your property or conducting any surveys. I'll argue that their claim is without merit and their presence constitutes harassment. That should keep them away while we finalize the permanent protection." Over the next week, Patricia worked quickly. The injunction was granted. Dalton Development's claim was challenged in court, and Clara's property boundaries were officially confirmed, leaving no room for dispute or reinterpretation. But the real change came from the community. Word had spread about what happened at the threshold site. The survey team talked, despite Dalton's attempts to keep them quiet. And instead of dismissing the stories as crazy mountain superstition, people started coming forward with their own experiences. An elderly woman who'd lived on a mountain for 60 years told about lights she'd seen rising from specific locations. Strange sounds, areas where her dogs refused to go and her cattle wouldn't graze. A logger who'd worked these forests for 30 years talked about places where his chainsaw wouldn't start, where his equipment malfunctioned consistently, where he learned to work around certain areas without understanding why. A biology professor from a university mentioned unusual plant species that only grew in specific microclimates, defying normal ecological patterns. None of them used the word threshold. Most of them didn't have language for what they'd experienced. But they all recognized that something in these mountains was different, special, worth protecting. Sarah organized a community meeting at the library in Marshall. Clara attended reluctantly, uncomfortable with public attention, but knowing her presence mattered. Nearly 40 people showed up, mountain residents, longtime families, even a few newcomers who'd heard the stories and were curious. Sarah stood at the front of the room and presented her proposal. We want to create a network of protected lands across the Blue Ridge. Properties that have ecological, cultural, or historical significance. Places that should be preserved for future generations. She showed maps marking potential conservation easement properties. Clara's land was one of them, but so were a dozen others scattered across the mountain range, each one corresponding to locations where Clara knew threshold sites existed. This isn't about restricting your use of your own property, Sarah continued. You retain ownership. You can still live there, farm there, use the land as you always have, but you legally prevent future development. You ensure that these special places stay wild and protected. An older man in the back raised his hand. What about property values? Conservation easements can lower what the land's worth. They can, Patricia Chin acknowledged, standing to address the concern. But they also provide tax benefits. And more importantly, they protect you from pressure to sell to developers. You maintain control over your legacy. The discussions continue for 2 hours. Questions about implementation. Concerns about government overreach. Debate about whether protection was necessary or just unnecessary restriction. But slowly consensus formed. People who'd lived on this mountain for generations recognized that something was changing. Pressure from development. Wealthy outsiders buying property for vacation homes. The slow erosion of the wild spaces that had defined these mountains for millennia. By the end of the meeting, 15 property owners had signed preliminary agreements to explore conservation easements. 15 pieces of land that would be protected. And according to Clara's threshold sense, at least 8 of those properties contained active threshold sites. Section 12. The final acceptance, Clara's complete transformation. 6 months after the threshold beings had first emerged from spotted eggs, Clara stood in the same spot where she confronted Dalton's survey team. But everything had changed. The conservation easement on her property had been finalized. Legal protection that would last forever, ensuring that no development could ever disturb the threshold sites under her care. Across the mountain range, 12 other easements had been completed, with more in progress. A network of protected land that preserved not just wilderness, but something deeper, something most people couldn't see, but instinctively recognized as important. Clara had changed too. The transformation Thomas warned her about had progressed gradually but unmistakably. She could see the threshold sites across entire valleys now, could sense disturbances from miles away, could communicate with the old earth in ways that went beyond words or symbols. But she hadn't lost herself, hadn't become like Patricia Vance, too changed to function in the human world. She'd learned to walk the boundary between keeper and human, honoring both roles without sacrificing either. Sarah visited weekly now, bringing news of other threshold sites, other potential keepers being identified and trained. The work was growing beyond just Clara's property, becoming something larger, a movement to protect the places where old Earth and new Earth met, where impossible things were possible, where the world was deeper and stranger than most people imagined. Dr. Morrison had published a paper on sacred ecological sites in Appalachia, carefully worded to avoid mentioning threshold beings directly, but documenting the patterns Clara and Sarah had identified. The academic community was starting to pay attention, starting to recognize that some places deserve protection for reasons that went beyond standard environmental criteria. And the threshold beings themselves had returned, though not in the dramatic way they'd first emerged. Clara saw them sometimes at twilight, shapes moving through the forest, checking the boundaries, ensuring the covenant was being honored. They never approached her directly, but she felt their approval, their acceptance of her guardianship. The chickens had laid one more spotted egg, just one, 3 months after first hatching. Clara had kept it, let it develop, watched it glow and pulse, and eventually hatch into a single threshold being that had risen into the sky and disappeared just like its predecessors. But she understood now that the eggs weren't random. They were communication. The old earth reaching out to test whether humans were ready to coexist respectfully or whether they needed to be driven away from threshold sites entirely. Her chickens had been chosen as messengers because they were hers, because she lived on the boundary, because the threshold wanted to see how she would respond. And she responded with fear at first, then curiosity, then protection, then acceptance. She'd passed every test. Standing at the threshold site now, Clara placed her hand on one of the covenant stones and felt the pulse of the old earth beneath her palm. Steady, ancient, patient. She was 53 years old. She'd lost her husband 15 years ago and had spent those years in isolation, trying to outrun grief. But grief had a purpose. She understood now. It had brought her here, to this mountain, to this solitude, to this exact spot where she could hear what the earth was saying. The threshold didn't need someone strong or fearless or certain. It needed someone who'd been broken and rebuilt. Someone who understood loss and transformation. Someone who knew that change was terrifying but also necessary. It had chosen well. Clara would spend the rest of her life here, protecting these sites, training others who showed the gift, ensuring the knowledge wasn't lost again. It was hard work, lonely sometimes, overwhelming often, but it was hers, and it mattered, and that was enough. She walked back to her cabin as the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The chickens followed her, clucking contentedly. The forest hummed with evening sounds. Everything peaceful, everything exactly as it should be. And beneath it all, deep underground, the threshold pulsed with ancient life. Protected, honored, connected to a keeper who understood her role and would fulfill it faithfully. Clara smiled as she climbed her porch steps. Tomorrow she'd check the northern site. Next week she'd meet with Sarah and the new property owners. Next month, she'd help establish another conservation easement. The work would continue. The covenant would hold. The old earth would remember that at least some humans still knew how to listen. And Clara Brennan, keeper of thresholds, guardian of boundaries, bridge between worlds, would be here, where she belonged, doing what she was meant to do, for as long as the mountain needed her.